Louisa Bellamy Grey, Duchess of Rosmere, sat at the writing table in the blue morning room, and dated her farewell note the 4th of October in the year 1817, in a hand so level that a stranger might have thought she was settling an account with a chandler rather than closing a marriage. She did not cry. She did not blot the page. She did not reach for a second sheet. She dipped her father's pen once, wrote the date, wrote the salutation, and did not pause again until the last line was dry. Then she set the pen down flat beside the paper, both hands steady on the wood, as though she were laying a tool back in its proper drawer, and she sat a moment looking at what she had made. 11 lines, not one crossed word, not one letter blotted, not one comma misplaced, not one word she would need to explain later to anyone, ever, for any reason. She folded it in thirds, sealed it with plain wax and no crest, and set it upright against the clock on the mantel, where he would find it before the servants did. By the time he read it, she intended to be 3 miles gone, and perfectly, unimpeachably correct in every particular of her leaving. It would take him a great deal longer to become either of those two things himself. The autumn of 1817 had come to Rosmere the way autumn always did in Wiltshire, early, wet, and entirely indifferent to the households it moved through. It found the estate much as it had found it for 3 years running, hedges trimmed on schedule, tenant rolls paid on the quarter day, the great house standing handsome and cold as a well-kept ledger nobody had troubled to warm. Louisa had married Edmund Grey, 6th Duke of Rosmere, in the spring of 1814, when she was 22, and he was a man of 30, who had already perfected the particular stillness of someone doing arithmetic he disliked. She had come to him with no fortune worth naming, and a dowry of exactly one thing: precision. Her father, Josiah Bellamy, had kept the school at Fenbridge for 24 years, and what he had given his only daughter, in place of land or coin, was a mind that did not make mistakes it had not chosen to make. It had seemed, in the first year, a fair trade. Rosmere needed a mistress who could read a lease without a solicitor standing over her shoulder, who could correct a steward's arithmetic without raising her voice, who could run a household of 40 on a budget that had been quietly mismanaged for a decade before her arrival. She had done all of it. She had done it so well, so continuously, and so invisibly that by the 3rd year it had stopped looking like work at all. It had simply become the temperature of the house, cool, orderly, functioning. The way a well-built roof stops looking like carpentry and starts looking like weather. Nobody thanks a roof. Edmund did not mistreat her. That was the difficult part. The part she had turned over many times in the quiet hours before her ration of grief ran out. He was never unkind in the way that left a mark anyone else could see. He simply corrected her. He corrected her diction at breakfast, her arithmetic at dinner, her opinions in company, always gently, always for her own improvement, always in the particular flat voice of a man reading a bill of sale. He had a horror of imprecision that predated her by decades, though she had not yet learned why, and he applied it to her the way another man might apply oil to a hinge, not out of malice, simply because a thing that did not run smoothly troubled him. She had told herself for 3 years that being corrected was not the same as being unloved. She had told herself this the way one tells oneself a hem will hold. And then, on the 2nd Tuesday of October, before 6 guests and 11 servants, in the dining room where she had personally supervised every candle and every course, he had corrected her grammar as though she were a schoolgirl who had not yet earned the right to speak in her own house. it had not been shouted. It had not needed to be. Lady Honoria Vance, his father's sister, had asked Louisa to read aloud the closing lines of an invitation to the harvest assembly, the kind of small domestic courtesy that had, until that evening, meant nothing at all. Louisa had read it. She had used the word were correctly in a sentence that required it, the way her father had taught her at 8 years old, with a switch of willow and a patience she still measured herself against. "It is was, my dear," Edmund had said, not looking up from his wine. "Surely even you know that much." The table had gone quiet, in the particular way a room goes quiet when everyone in it has decided, together and without a word passed between them, to pretend they have heard nothing. A footman near the sideboard had gone very still. Lady Honoria had smiled into her glass. Louisa had felt the correction land somewhere just beneath her sternum, precise as a pin, and she had understood in that instant, not with anger, which came later and quieter, but with a kind of cold clarity, that he did not know he was wrong, that he had never once, in 3 years, imagined the possibility that she was not the one who needed correcting. She had set down her own glass. She had said, of course, in a voice that gave nothing away, and she had finished the evening exactly as a duchess ought, attentive, gracious, correct. And she had gone up to bed at the usual hour, and lain awake, counting the ways a marriage could be a kind of employment a woman was never actually paid for. By morning, she had stopped counting and started writing. She had allowed herself, by the small clock on her dressing table, 11 minutes of something that was not quite weeping, a tight, dry, seated grief, hands folded, breath counted, because 11 minutes was what she had allowed herself for every loss since her father died, no more and no less, and then she had opened the drawer where she kept such feelings, set this one inside among the others, and closed it. Then she had taken out paper and her father's pen, and she had begun to write the only document in the house that evening which would contain, from first word to last, not one single error. She left it propped against the clock where he would see it first, before the servants brought the morning tray, before Lady Honoria could arrange herself to witness his face. Some things a woman did not owe an audience. This was one of them. Then she took a small trunk already packed the night before, walked out through the garden door rather than the front, and set off on foot across the home wood toward the old schoolhouse at Fenbridge, where her father had lived and taught and died, and which was, by the terms of his will, the one piece of ground in all of Wildshire that belonged to her and to no one else. She did not look back at the house. She had already said everything she meant to say to it, and she had said it correctly. The Duke of Rosmere found the note at 8:30, standing in the blue morning room in his shirt-sleeves, with his coffee going cold in his hand, and it took him 3 full readings to understand that his wife had not misspoken once in 11 lines, and that this, more than her leaving, was the fact he could not put down. The dining room the previous evening had held 6 guests, 11 servants, and 1 silence that would be discussed in 3 counties by Michaelmas. Lady Honoria Vance had chosen the moment with the care of a woman who had been choosing such moments for 30 years. She had asked, in the mild voice she reserved for traps, whether the young Duchess would do them the kindness of reading the invitation aloud, so that they might all judge whether the wording pleased. It was the sort of request that could not be refused without seeming odd, and Louisa, who had drafted the invitation herself in an hour that morning, between the linen accounts and a tenant dispute over a boundary hedge, had not thought to refuse it. She had read it well. She had read it, in fact, exactly as her father had taught her to read anything meant to be heard, rather than merely seen evenly, without ornament, each word given its full and separate weight. When she reached the line concerning the weather that had attended the previous year's harvest, she had used were because the sentence demanded a condition contrary to fact. Because if the weather were fine, we should be glad of it, and any child at Fembridge School who had survived Josiah Bellamy's tutelage past the age of 9 knew the difference in their sleep. Edmund had not looked up. That was, later, the detail Louisa returned to most often. Not the correction itself, but the fact that he had delivered it without lifting his eyes from his wine, as though she were a clerk reciting figures he had already checked twice, and found wanting a third time out of habit. "It is was, my dear," he had said. "Surely even you know that much." A footman near the sideboard, a young man named Tam Wicks, who had grown up on Rossmere land, and whose mother had been taught her letters at Fembridge by Louisa's own father, had gone very still, the way a man goes still when he has heard something he is not permitted to react to. Lady Honoria had lowered her face to her glass, in the particular manner of someone hiding a smile rather than sharing one. Two of the guests had found the tablecloth suddenly fascinating. Louisa had felt the words land beneath her breastbone, precise as a pin driven by a steady hand, and in the space of perhaps 4 seconds she had made 3 decisions in quick succession. She would not correct him in front of the servants, because that was not a kindness she was willing to spend on a man who had not offered her the same. She would not excuse him either, because silence was not the same as agreement, whatever he chose to believe. And she would finish the evening exactly as a duchess ought, gracious, attentive, flawless. Because there was a particular dignity in being wronged well, and she intended that night of all nights to claim it. Of course, she had said, and the 2 words had cost her nothing anyone at the table could see. She had guided the conversation back to the harvest assembly, with the same steady competence she brought to everything, and by the time the ladies withdrew she had extracted a promise from Mrs. Thorne about the loan of extra chairs, and settled a small disagreement between 2 neighbouring families over the seating, without either party noticing they had been managed. She had gone up at the usual hour. She had undressed herself rather than ring for her maid, because she did not trust her face for company of any kind, even a kind one, and she had sat a long while at the window, with her hands folded in her lap, doing the thing she did instead of weeping, which was counting. She counted 11 minutes by the little clock her father had left her. The same 11 minutes she permitted any grief, no more, no less, a discipline installed so early in her life she no longer remembered choosing it. When the 11 minutes ended she opened the private drawer of her mind where such things were kept. The loss of her father, the 2 children she and Edmund had wanted and not yet been given, 3 years of corrections delivered like small bills come due, and she set this new grief inside among the others. And she closed the drawer, and she got up. Then she took inventory, because inventory was the second thing her father had taught her, directly after precision, and the 2 had never once failed to serve her. She owned the schoolhouse at Fembridge outright, willed to her free and clear of any claim Rossmere or its duke might make. She owned her father's ledgers, 40 years of them, kept in a hand so exact that the parish had used his figures as the standard against which all others were checked. She owned a small annuity settled on her at marriage that no one, not even a duke, could touch without her signature. And she owned, above all else, a mind that had never once, in 28 years, produced a sentence it could not defend. That was not nothing. She had spent 3 years being made to feel that it was. She wrote the note before dawn, dated it correctly, sealed it without a crest, and walked out through the garden door with a single packed trunk and her father's pen in her pocket, because there were things in this world worth carrying, and a man's approval had simply, quietly, stopped being one of them. The path to Fenbridge ran 3 miles through the home wood and along the mill stream, and she knew it the way she knew her own hand, having walked it 1,000 times as a girl carrying her father's dinner to the schoolroom door. The schoolhouse had stood empty since his death 2 years before, kept in trust, its windows shuttered, its garden gone to bramble. She reached it a little after 7, unlocked the door with the key she had never stopped carrying, and stood a moment in the cold front room breathing in dust and chalk and old paper, and something in her chest, which had been held very tight since the previous evening, loosened by perhaps 1 full turn. She did not know yet what she meant to build there. She knew only that she meant to build something, and that whatever it was would not require anyone's permission. She was still standing in the doorway, deciding where to begin, when she heard a cart on the lane, and looked up to find Mrs. Odell, who had kept house at Rossmere for 26 years, and had buried 2 husbands and outlasted 4 dukes' tempers, climbing down with a basket over one arm, and an expression that suggested she had walked into this particular weather before, and did not intend to make a fuss about it now. "Thought you'd want bread," Mrs. Odell said, setting the basket on the step, "and I'll not ask what happened, because I already know, and I'll not tell you what I think of it, because you already know that too." "Thank you," Louisa said. "Don't thank me yet. Thank me when the roof's fixed." Mrs. Odell looked up at the sagging thatch with the flat disapproval of a woman assessing a debt. "That'll take doing before winter." "I know how to fix a roof," Louisa said. "My father taught me that as well." Mrs. Odell's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "I don't doubt it for a moment, Your Grace. I never have." She left the basket and the cart, and walked back up the lane without another word. Which was, Louisa understood, the entire eulogy Mrs. Odell intended to deliver on the subject of the Duke of Rossmere's conduct, and she found she needed no more than that. The roof at Fenbridge School had wanted mending for 2 winters, and Louisa began there, because a competence trial, she had learned from her father, was best begun with a problem that could be measured in exact quantities rather than feelings. Thatch was sold by the bundle. Bundles could be counted. She counted 41, priced them against the thatcher's usual rate, found the figure he first quoted her inflated by nearly 1/3, and told him so plainly, with the relevant sums written out in a hand he could not argue with, even though his face suggested he badly wanted to. "Beg pardon, Your Grace, but a woman doesn't generally know thatch prices," he said. "This woman kept her father's accounts from the age of 12, Louisa said. "The bundle rate at Michaelmas Fair was 4 shillings, not 6. I have the receipt from 2 years past, in his hand, if you would like to see it." She had the receipt. She showed it to him. He did the roof for 4 shillings the bundle, and did not attempt to inflate a figure to her again. It was a small victory, the kind that would never be spoken of in a drawing-room, and it was the first thing in 3 years that had belonged entirely to her. The larger trial came a fortnight later, when Mr. Crouch, who had managed the Rossmere land for 11 years, and regarded the schoolhouse and its new occupant as no concern of his, arrived at her door with a face like a closed account book to inform her that the mill-stream boundary between the school's 3 acres and the neighbouring Aldridge farm had been in dispute since before he took the post, and that his Grace's man of business had twice failed to settle it, and that he supposed, since she was living there now, she ought to know before the Aldridges' cattle wandered through her garden again. Louisa asked to see the original survey. Mr. Crouch informed her, with the patience of a man explaining rain to a child, that the original survey had been lost these 30 years. Louisa asked whether her father's ledgers might contain a copy, since Josiah Bellamy had been asked, in his time, to witness half the boundary agreements in the parish, on account of being the one man in Fenbridge whose hand nobody ever thought to dispute. They found it in the 11th volume, dated 1793, in her father's small exact writing, with a hand-drawn plan of the Millstream boundary so precise it might have been drafted with a surveyor's chain rather than a schoolmaster's ruler. It settled the dispute in a single afternoon. It also settled, in Mr. Crouch's private estimation, a question he had not known he was asking, which was whether the new mistress of the schoolhouse was merely a duchess playing at industry, or something considerably more durable. "I'll not say I was wrong about you," he told her, on his way out, hat in his hands, turning it once. "I'll say I hadn't yet been right." It was, from Mr. Crouch, the equivalent of a standing ovation. Word of the boundary settlement reached Rossmere within the week, carried the way such things always travelled in a small county, through a groom to a footman to a lady's maid to a drawing-room, and Edmund Gray heard it second-hand, over breakfast, from Lady Honoria, who delivered it with the light. Careless tone of a woman remarking on weather she found mildly disappointing. "Your Duchess has taken up land management, it seems," she said. "How industrious she has become." She meant, and Edmund understood perfectly well that she meant, how visible she has become, and how inconvenient that is to us both. But he said nothing, because he had learned very early in his aunt's house that saying nothing was the safest available answer to almost everything she said. He rode past the schoolhouse 3 days later, ostensibly on a state business that could easily have waited, and saw his wife standing in the newly mended dooryard with Mr. Crouch's boundary map spread across a trestle table, explaining something to 2 tenant farmers with her sleeves pushed back and chalk dust on her hands. And she was laughing at something one of the farmers had said, not the polite social laugh she produced at dinner, but a real one, quick and unguarded, gone as soon as it came. He had not heard that laugh in 3 years of marriage. He had not known, until its absence was suddenly explained to him from a distance of 40 yards, that he had missed it. He did not stop. He told himself he had business at the mill. But he thought about the sound of it the whole ride home, and that night, for the first time since her leaving, he took down the invitation she had drafted and read the disputed line again, slowly, alone, with no one to correct, and no one to correct him. If the weather were fine, we should be glad of it. He read it 4 times. On the 4th reading, something cold and old and very familiar moved behind his ribs, and he set the paper down and did not sleep well. The cold in Edmund Gray had a history, though he had spent most of his life pretending it did not. And the history began not with Louisa, but with a woman he rarely permitted himself to think of by name. His mother had come to Rossmere at 19, the daughter of a Bristol merchant with more ships than lineage, and Lady Honoria, his father's younger sister, unmarried then, and living at Rossmere on the old Duke's charity, had made it her particular project, in the first month of that marriage, to demonstrate to the assembled county exactly how far trade money fell short of blood. It had taken almost nothing. A single evening, a single mispronounced word at a dinner, not unlike the one Louisa had endured 3 years into her own marriage, a mistake so small that most of the guests had not even noticed it. And Honoria's soft, delighted correction, delivered in front of the old Duke and 40 guests, that had made the whole room understand, without anyone saying so directly, that the new Duchess did not belong. Edmund had been 7 years old, watching from the gallery stairs where children were meant to be neither seen nor heard, and he had watched his mother's face go still and pale and careful in a way he had not understood then, and understood perfectly now. He had watched his father, over the following months, grow colder toward her by degrees too small to name individually, and impossible to miss in some. Had watched him find reasons to dine in town, had watched the house grow quieter and quieter around a woman who had stopped, by inches, defending herself, until by the time Edmund was 11 she had stopped speaking at dinner altogether, and by the time he was 13 she was dead of what the physician called a wasting of the lungs, and what the servants, in whispers he was not meant to hear, called a wasting of the heart. Honoria had raised him after. Honoria had taught him, gently, patiently, that precision was armour, that a person who could not be faulted for their words could not be shamed for anything at all, and that the kindest thing a man could do for a woman he loved was to correct her small errors before the world had the chance to correct her larger ones. He had believed this so completely for so long that he had never once examined it the way a man raised beside a particular smell stops noticing it is there. He had married Louisa for her competence, which he valued, and had corrected her from the first month, which he had believed, genuinely, wretchedly believed, was a form of protecting her. He understood, alone in his study at midnight with her flawless farewell note in one hand and her flawless invitation in the other, that he had spent 3 years protecting his wife from a shame that had never once threatened her, in order to guard against a shame that had already happened, decades ago, to someone else. He did not go to her that night. He was not yet ready for what going to her would require him to say, and he had learned, at least, that an unready apology was worth less than none at all. He rode to Fembridge instead a week later, and stood at the edge of her dooryard without dismounting, and watched her teach 6 tenant children their letters on a slate she had chalked herself. Patient in a way he had never once seen her patient with him, and Lady Honoria, watching the same road from a different window entirely, decided that the time for waiting had ended. Miss Arabella Fenn arrived at Rosmere on a wet Thursday at the end of October, ostensibly to visit her godmother, Lady Honoria, for a fortnight, though the length of the visit, the timing of it, and the careful arrangement of a dinner 3 days later, at which she and Edmund were seated with a great deal of deliberate proximity, told a story none of the 3 principals troubled to speak aloud. Arabella was 19, well-bred, correctly educated, possessed of an income and a diction that would have satisfied even Lady Honoria's most exacting standard, and entirely, visibly miserable to be there. She found Louisa first, in fact before she found Edmund, arriving at the schoolhouse 2 days after her own arrival at Rosmere, on the pretext of admiring the county air, and standing in the mended dooryard twisting her gloves with the particular unhappiness of a young woman being used for a purpose she had not chosen. "I did not come here to take anything from you," she said, before Louisa had even offered her tea. "I want you to know that. My godmother believes, she has decided, that the Duke's marriage has failed, and that I am to be ready when it does. I have told her I want no part of it. She does not hear me when I say things she has not already decided to hear. I believe you," Louisa said, and meant it, and set the kettle on. "Sit down. You look as though you have been standing for a fortnight." Arabella sat. She talked, once she began, the way people talk when they have been carrying something silently for too long, about Honoria's letters to her mother promising a settlement in exchange for her cooperation, about a fortnight of pointed dinners and pointed silences, about her own dawning understanding that she was not a guest at Rosmere but an instrument, polished and positioned. She talked, too, without quite meaning to, about a detail that made Louisa go very still over the teapot, that Honoria kept a small locked writing box in her sitting room, which she had once, by accident, seen opened, and inside it had been letters, old letters, yellowed, tied with ribbon gone grey, and a school ledger that was not, Arabella was almost certain, the same ledger the vicar used for the parish accounts. I only saw it a moment, Arabella said. She was very displeased I had seen it at all. Louisa set down the teapot with great care. Do you recall which ledger? Fenbridge School, I think. There was a figure on the cover. A year, 1809 perhaps, or 1808. Louisa's father had died in the spring of 1815, having kept the Fenbridge school accounts, without interruption, for 24 years, in a hand so exact the parish had used it as its own standard. There had never, in her memory, been any question of a second ledger, kept elsewhere, by anyone. That night, for the first time since she had left Rosmere, Louisa did not sit with her father's real ledgers merely to remember him. She sat with them to find something. She found it by candlelight, 3 nights later, in the 11th volume, the same volume that had settled the Aldridge boundary, a column of annual figures for the parish school subscription that her father had recorded faithfully every autumn, and beside it, in his small careful hand, a private note she had read 100 times as a girl, without once understanding its weight. Subscription received, £40. Subscription recorded to parish, £26. Discrepancy unresolved, referred to Lady H.V. As trustee no reply received, this 3rd time of asking. £14 a year, missing, for as many years as her father had dared record the discrepancy before he stopped asking, and simply kept his own true account instead, quietly, faithfully, in case anyone ever needed the truth of it. Louisa sat a long while with the ledger open on her knee, her father's pen resting beside it, and felt something settle in her chest that was not quite anger, and was not quite grief, but was, more than either, the particular stillness of a woman who has just been handed exactly the tool she needs, and intends to use it without haste. The counterpunch, when it came, arrived by way of a letter delivered to half the drawing-rooms in Wildshire within the same week, purporting to be copied from Louisa's own correspondence, and containing errors so crude, a misused apostrophe, a verb that disagreed with its subject twice in one sentence, that anyone who had ever received an actual letter from the Duchess of Rosmere might have paused over it, had the county not been so eager to believe what it already suspected. Louisa did not weep over the forgery, though she recognised immediately, and with a coldness that surprised even her, precisely whose hand had shaped it. She recognised it because she had seen samples of Lady Honoria's true handwriting on the guest list for the Harvest Assembly, and the forger, in trying to imitate an uneducated woman's script, had betrayed the careful, deliberate loops of someone who wrote correctly by habit and had to work, consciously, to make an error look natural. A person does not make mistakes convincingly who has spent a lifetime making none. She set the forged letter beside 3 genuine ones in her own hand, side by side on the trestle table, and studied them the way her father had taught her to study any disputed document, not for what it wished to say, but for what it could not help revealing about the hand that made it. Mr. Whitlow, the parish clerk, had kept the register at Fenbridge Church for 30 years, and had witnessed more marriages, christenings, and disputed wills than any man in the county, which meant he had also spent 30 years comparing hands for a living, quietly, without any of the drama of a courtroom. Louisa rode to see him on a grey morning with the forged letter, 3 of her own, and her father's ledger in a leather case under her arm, and laid all of it on his table without preamble. "I should like your opinion, Mistress Whitlow, on whether these were written by the same person." He took his time. He held the letters to the window light, turned them, held them again. "This one," he said at last, tapping the forgery, "wants to look careless and doesn't manage it. See here and here, the pen never once hesitates. A careless hand hesitates, your grace. It corrects itself, crosses out, presses too hard when it's cross and too light when it's tired. This was written slow and careful by someone practising being sloppy. That's a harder trick than it sounds, and whoever did it hasn't quite the knack. And do you recognise the practised hand beneath it?" Mr. Whitlow was quiet a moment. He had witnessed a great many documents in 30 years, and knew better than most men in the county the particular cost of naming a lady of quality as a forger. "I recognise a hand that signed the parish subscription book for 11 years running," he said finally, "before it stopped signing it at all, round about the time your father began keeping his own quiet count instead. I did wonder, at the time, why a trustee would stop signing her own accounts. I am an old man, your grace, and old men are permitted to wonder a great many things without saying them aloud. But you have asked me plainly, and I find I am tired of wondering quietly." He agreed, without being asked twice, to say as much before witnesses, should witnesses ever be required. They were required within the fortnight. Lady Honoria, sensing perhaps that the ground beneath her scheme had begun to shift, though not yet understanding how far, moved to close the matter before it could be examined further, and sent word to Edmund that the county's confidence in his Duchess's discretion had, regrettably, become a subject of general remark, and that a quiet arrangement, an extended visit to a distant relation, perhaps, until the talk subsided, might spare the family further embarrassment. It was, Edmund realised, reading the letter twice by lamplight, precisely the manoeuvre his aunt had once used on his mother, offered in precisely the same reasonable, regretful tone, and he understood with a lurch that he had very nearly written the reply she wanted before he caught himself. He rode to Fembridge instead, at an hour that suited no propriety at all, and found Louisa still awake over the ledger by candlelight, and stood in her doorway with his hat in his hands, turning it, the way Mr. Crouch had once turned his. "I read the invitation again," he said. "The one from the dinner. You were right. You have always been right, in every particular I troubled to check, and in a great many I did not think to check because I had already decided, before you ever opened your mouth, that a Bellamy could not outspeak a Grey." Louisa set down her pen. "Say the rest of it." "My mother," he said, and stopped. Started again. "My mother made one error, once, at a dinner not unlike ours, and my aunt corrected her in front of 40 people, and I watched my father grow cold to her by inches over the following 6 years until she died of it, though no physician ever wrote that down. I have spent my whole life believing that if I corrected every small fault before the world could see it, I could keep the people I loved from what happened to her. I did not understand, until a fortnight ago, that I had simply become the person who did the correcting, instead of the one standing beside her while it happened. It was not, Louisa noted, an apology. It was an explanation, offered honestly and at real cost, and she had learned from her father the precise and considerable difference between the two. "That is not sorry," she said. "That is why. I require both. Eventually, I do not require both tonight." "What do you require tonight?" "Sit down," she said, "and read this ledger with me, and tell me whether you recognize your aunt's hand in the subscription column for 1809, because tomorrow I intend to ask her about it in front of every person who has ever doubted mine." He sat. He recognized it within a minute, and something in his face went the particular grey of a man watching a debt come due that he had spent his whole life pretending was someone else's. The Harvest Assembly at Fenbridge was, by long custom, the one gathering in the parish where gentry and tenant sat under the same roof, and it was for this reason, and no other, that Louisa chose it. She had sent word a week in advance, through Mr. Whitlow, that the accounts of the Fenbridge School subscription, long a matter of some confusion, would be laid open for any subscriber to examine, as was, she noted mildly, every subscriber's right. It was an invitation no one could refuse without appearing to have something to hide, which was of course precisely its design. She stood at the long table in the assembly hall with her father's ledger open before her, and Edmund beside her, not speaking, not yet, but present, which was itself a fact the room noted and weighed, and she laid out the figures without heat, the way she had laid out the thatch bundles and the boundary survey, one honest number beside another. £40 subscribed, each year for 11 years, she said. £26 recorded to the parish. My father noted the discrepancy each autumn, and referred it, as trustee, to Lady Honoria Vance, 3 times by his own written account, without reply. A schoolmaster's private notations, Lady Honoria said, from her place near the fire, in the light. Careless voice she had used on the 4th of October, proved nothing but a schoolmaster's suspicions. They would prove nothing alone, Louisa agreed. "Mr. Whitlow, would you show the assembly what you showed me?" "Mr." Whitlow came forward with the forged letter, and 3 genuine ones, and explained, in the plain, unhurried voice of a man who had spent 30 years being believed precisely because he never hurried, the difference between a careless hand and a careful hand practising carelessness, and named, without flinching, now that the moment had actually arrived, whose hand he judged the practised one to be. It was Tam Wicks, the young footman, who finished it. He had not been asked to speak. He stood at the back of the hall in his good coat, turning his own hat exactly as Edmund and Crouch had both turned theirs, and said, into the silence that followed Mr. Whitlow's testimony, that he had carried a sealed letter to the posting-house himself, a fortnight past, on Lady Honoria's own instruction, and had thought nothing of it at the time beyond noting, because his mother had been taught her letters by Josiah Bellamy, and he therefore noticed such things, that the direction on the outside was written in a hand that did not match the hand he had watched her ladyship use, not 5 minutes before, to sign the Assembly's guest book. The room did not gasp. It did something quieter and more final than that, it turned, the way a tide turns, not all at once but everywhere at the same moment, 40 separate faces reorganizing 40 separate opinions in the space of a single held breath, and Lady Honoria felt it happen the way a woman feels a chair pulled gently from beneath her before she has finished sitting down. Something behind her composure, some old confident thing that had carried her through 30 years of quiet cruelties, simply went out. Louisa let the silence hold a moment longer than was comfortable, because she had learned that silence, held correctly, did more work than any accusation. "I could lay the matter before the magistrate," she said at last. £14 a year, 11 years, is a sum Sir Roger Yale would take seriously, and I do not say that lightly. I choose not to. Not because the debt is forgiven. Fenbridge School will have every shilling restored, beginning this quarter, from Lady Honoria's own income, and Sir Roger will hold the account until it is settled in full. But because I find I would rather spend my time building a school than ruining a woman, however much she may have earned it. That is not mercy for her sake. It is a decision about what I wish to spend my life doing. Lady Honoria left the hall without another word, her back very straight, and did not attend another gathering in the parish that season, and the cost of the mercy she had been shown sat on her, everyone agreed afterward, considerably heavier than any public disgrace could have. Edmund did not speak to the assembly at all. He waited until the hall had emptied, until it was only the two of them and the ledger and the long table gone quiet, and then he said the thing he had been carrying since Fenbridge candlelight a week before. "It is were," he said. "It was always were. You have been correct since the day I met you, in every particular that mattered, and I did not have the character to admit it until a room full of my own tenants had to teach me what my wife already knew." "That is an explanation," Louisa said. "It is a good one. I still require the other." "I am sorry," he said. "Not for correcting a word. For 3 years of believing that loving you meant keeping you from ever being wrong, when what I was actually doing was making certain you never felt safe enough to simply be yourself in front of me. My mother was corrected once, publicly, and I watched it end her by inches, and I became, without ever choosing to, the very thing that ended her. I am sorry for that. I do not expect the sorrow to undo it. It does not, Louisa said. But it is a beginning, and I have learned to value beginnings correctly measured over declarations I cannot verify. She set her conditions the following evening, in the study at Rosmere, itemised aloud the way she had once itemised thatch bundles, because she had learned that a woman's terms, stated plainly, held better than any promise dressed in feeling. I will have full authority over the school at Fenbridge, and any charitable subscription bearing my father's name, answerable to no trustee but myself. My correspondence will not be read, corrected, or discussed before it is sent. If you believe I have erred, in speech or in anything else, you will say so to me, privately, once, and you will hear my answer before you decide whether I was wrong. And you will not ever again correct me before a servant, a guest, or a stranger. Whatever needs correcting between us will be settled here, in this room by the two of us, or it will not be settled by you at all. All right, Edmund said. All right, then, Louisa said. And that was the whole of the treaty. 4 words traded twice over, and it held better than any speech either of them could have made. Miss Arabella Fenn left Rosmere the following week for her aunt's house in Bath, with a letter of introduction from Louisa herself to a lady there who ran a school for girls of good family and modest fortune, and a standing invitation to visit Fenbridge whenever she liked, which she did twice that winter, and became within the year something between a friend and a colleague, teaching the older girls their sums on Tuesdays. The winter that followed was not a season of grand gestures, it was a season of small ones, counted deliberately, because Louisa had learned that nothing in isolation proved anything at all, and everything in accumulation proved a great deal. Edmund began, without being asked, to move his chair beside hers in the evenings rather than across from her, close enough that the fire warmed them both from the same angle. He brought her tea before she rang for it, correctly made, remembering without being told that she took it with honey and not sugar, a fact he had never once in 3 years troubled to learn. He asked, over the school ledger one January evening, whether she thought the subscription might stretch to a second teacher for the younger children. And when she said it might, if the roof repair came in under budget, he said, then let it come in under budget, and rode out the next morning to negotiate the Thatcher's rate himself, badly, so that she had to correct his arithmetic with a patience she found, to her own quiet surprise, came easily now that it was freely given rather than owed. He began, too, to use words she recognised as her father's. Precision is a kindness, not a cruelty, offered once at a dinner when a young curate stumbled over a Latin phrase, and Edmund, instead of correcting him before the table, simply passed him the correct word quietly, under cover of the soup course, so that only the curate himself ever knew a correction had been made at all. The relapse came in February, as she had privately expected it would, because change proven only once is not yet change at all. They hosted a small dinner, the first since the Harvest Assembly, and a young officer newly arrived in the county made the same small error Louisa had made in October. Used was where were was wanted, and Edmund, from long habit worn into a groove over 30 years, began to open his mouth to correct him before the whole table. Louisa touched his sleeve, lightly once, beneath the cloth where no one else could see. He stopped. He looked at her. Something crossed his face that was almost embarrassment and entirely gratitude, and he closed his mouth and let the sentence stand, and later that night, alone, he said, "I nearly did it again. I did not even choose to." My mouth simply began. "I know," Louisa said. "That is why I stopped you rather than waiting to see whether you would stop yourself. Old habits do not vanish because we have decided to be better. They vanish because we catch them, again and again, until catching them becomes the new habit." "Then catch me again," he said. "As often as it takes. I intend to," she said, and there was in the words something that was not quite forgiveness and not quite a promise, but stood very near the border of both. He said the rest of it in March in the schoolhouse dooryard, with the first real warmth of spring on the mended roof, and 6 tenant children's voices drifting through the open window, reciting their letters in a chorus that would have made her father smile. "I would choose you," he said, "not because I was given you, and not because a document once made it convenient. I have been choosing you for some months now, in small ways I did not always have the courage to name, and I find I would like to go on choosing you for a considerably longer time, if you will permit it. I do not say the 3 words easily, because I have watched what they cost when they are spoken, without proof behind them. I would rather show you over years than tell you once and consider the matter settled. That," Louisa said, "is the first sentence you have ever spoken to me that did not want a single word corrected." She reached into her pocket then and drew out her father's pen. The same steel-nibbed pen that had written the farewell note in October, that had settled the Aldridge boundary, that had signed every honest column in 11 volumes of ledgers, and pressed it into his hand. "Write something with it," she said, "anything true." He wrote, on the back of an old lesson slate propped against the schoolroom wall, in a hand considerably less steady than her own, but entirely his own effort, 4 words. "I was wrong. She was right." "There," Louisa said, reading it over his shoulder, "not one error." 2 years later, on a bright cold morning in the spring of 1819, the Duchess of Rosmere stood once more in the dooryard of the Fembridge School, though it bore, by then, a small carved sign above the door that read the Josiah Bellamy School, funded in perpetuity by subscription and by the Rosmere estate, wages posted plainly on the wall inside so that every teacher, from the newest assistant to Louisa herself, could see exactly what she was owed and know it would be paid. There were 3 teachers now instead of 1, and 40 children instead of 6, and Miss Arabella Fenn, who had married a Bath solicitor the previous autumn and moved only 12 miles distant, still came on Tuesdays to teach the older girls their sums, precisely as she had promised. Lady Honoria Vance lived quietly in a small house in Harrogate, on an income reduced by exactly the sum she had once taken, sending, each quarter without fail, the restitution Sir Roger Yale had arranged and continued to oversee, and writing, twice a year, letters to Edmund that he answered briefly and without cruelty, because Louisa had taught him, by example rather than instruction. That mercy once given did not require being reissued indefinitely to feel complete. Mr. Crouch had been made steward of the whole Rosmere estate the previous year, at Louisa's recommendation and Edmund's ready agreement, and kept the accounts now in a hand he had, with some private embarrassment, spent considerable effort improving, having decided a man ought not to keep sloppy books for a household that valued precision as its own particular kind of love. Tam Wicks had been sent, at Louisa's expense, to a grammar school in Wildshire Town, and wrote home each month in a hand that grew steadier with every letter, and signed himself always your obedient and grateful, which made Mrs. Odell laugh each time she read it aloud in the Rosmere kitchen. The house itself, visitors remarked that spring, had changed in some quality none of them could quite name. It was not the furniture, which was largely unaltered, nor the staff, most of whom remained. It was something in the air of the rooms themselves, a house that had held its breath for a generation, first under one Duchess and then under another, seemed at last, that spring, to have let it out. Louisa kept her father's pen on the writing-table in the blue morning-room now. Not locked away, not treated as a relic, but used daily for the school accounts and the estate correspondence both, because a tool that had once proven a woman's worth against a room full of doubters seemed to her the correct instrument for the ordinary, unglamorous business of a marriage well kept. Edmund had given her, that Christmas, a second pen to match it, steel-nibbed and plain, engraved along the barrel, with 4 words she recognised at once. Not one error. She had laughed when she read it, a real laugh, quick and unguarded, the kind Edmund had once heard from 40 yards and not known how badly he wanted to hear it again, and she had told him it was, on the whole, not entirely true, since she had made errors before, and would certainly make more, and perfection had never once been the actual point of any of it. "I know," he had said. "I gave it to you anyway, because I finally understand what my aunt never did, and what I very nearly spent my whole life failing to learn. It was never the errors that mattered. It was who stood beside you when you made one." She had married a man who once believed love meant guarding a woman from every small fault the world might find in her. She had taught him, without ever raising her voice to do it, that a person does not need guarding from their own imperfections nearly so much as they need someone willing to stand beside them regardless. She had stopped, somewhere in the space of that long year, asking to be seen. She had made herself, instead, impossible to unsee, not by shouting, not by breaking, but by building, patiently, in full daylight, until the whole county had no choice but to recalculate what it had once dismissed as merely useful. That was not a thing any man could correct out of her. It was not a thing, in the end, that anyone could take away at all.